Pakistan wanted applause, not peace, not stability, maybe not even the deal. Applause, because within hours of the US-Iran peace agreement being announced, Pakistan's leaders were already busy congratulating themselves. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif called himself the mediator. Pakistan's government spoke as if Islamabad had personally rescued the Middle East, and then somehow India got dragged into the story. Pakistan's Defence Minister Khawaja Asif stood up in the National Assembly to complain that PM Modi had not acknowledged Pakistan's role. Take a listen to this.
कल मोदी ने बयान दिया है, मुबारक दे रहा है वो ट्रंप को, प्रेसिडेंट ट्रंप को. उसको इतना दिल गुर्दा नहीं है उसमें कि उसमें पाकिस्तान का नाम जो है वो शामिल करे, जिसकी छप्पर छांव के नीचे ये सारा कुछ हो रहा है अल्लाह के फजल करम से.
Think about that for a moment. A country supposedly celebrating a historic diplomatic triumph was upset because India's Prime Minister did not clap loudly enough. And that may tell us more about Pakistan's insecurities than about its achievements. Because when we look closely at how the deal was actually sealed, a different story emerges. A story that leads not to Islamabad but to Doha. But let's start with Pakistan's moment in the sun. To be fair, Pakistan did play a role. Nobody seriously disputes that. When the US-Iran conflict escalated after the February strikes on Iran, Washington needed intermediaries. Pakistan had something valuable: access. It maintained channels with both Washington and Tehran, shared a border with Iran. Pakistani officials carried messages between the two sides. Islamabad hosted talks. Senior American officials publicly praised Pakistan's efforts. At that stage, Pakistan looked like a useful bridge. And Islamabad understandably believed it had earned a seat at the table. But there is a difference between being at the table and controlling the outcome. That distinction would become painfully clear. As negotiations progressed, Pakistan began behaving less like a facilitator and more like the owner of the process. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif publicly announced that the official signing ceremony would take place in Switzerland on June 19th. Delegations were being prepared, plans were being discussed. Pakistan appeared convinced that the climax of the entire peace process would unfold on its stage. And then reality intervened. Donald Trump sat down in France. The agreement was signed not in Switzerland, not on June 19th, not under Pakistan's spotlight. The deal was concluded days earlier than expected. The biggest diplomatic moment happened elsewhere, and Pakistan was left scrambling. Iran publicly clarified that there will be no Swiss signing event. The agreement had already been signed digitally. The ceremony Pakistan thought it would host simply did not exist. And Shehbaz Sharif's posts on X about hosting the signing ceremony were later pulled down unceremoniously. Imagine planning the wedding reception only to discover that the bride and groom got married 2 days ago. That was Pakistan's predicament. Now comes the part that Islamabad would rather not emphasize. According to multiple reports, including accounts from diplomats involved in the negotiations, the breakthrough came when Qatar stepped in more aggressively. Until then, Qatar had largely played a supporting role. Pakistan was the visible mediator. Qatar was in the background. Then the negotiations hit trouble. The interim arrangement was at risk. Momentum was fading. Trust was becoming an issue, and Washington turned to Qatar. What happened next was classic Qatari diplomacy. No grand speeches, no victory laps, no public declarations. A senior team of Qatari negotiators quietly traveled to Tehran. They spent nearly 17 hours in intense discussions behind closed doors, away from television cameras, away from social media, away from political grandstanding. And according to reports, it's those talks that helped push the agreement across the finish line. In diplomatic language, this is called back channel diplomacy. In simpler language, this is where the real work gets done. The obvious question is, why Qatar? The answer lies in Doha's unique position. For years, Qatar has cultivated relationships with actors who often refuse to speak directly to one another. United States, Iran, Taliban, Hamas, Israel, various regional governments. Qatar has spent decades building a reputation as the Middle East's emergency mediator. Sometimes controversial, sometimes frustrating, but undeniably influential. And unlike larger regional powers, Qatar's approach is usually discreet. It prefers results over headlines. That is why, when negotiations reached their most sensitive phase, Doha became indispensable. Even President Trump publicly singled out Qatar for praise. Standing alongside Qatar's emir at the G7 summit, Trump openly thanked Doha for helping secure the agreement. Notice something interesting. Trump praised Qatar repeatedly. Pakistan, not so much. That does not mean Pakistan did nothing. It means that when the deal was hanging by a thread, Washington believed Qatar could deliver what Pakistan could not. Which brings us back to Khawaja Asif. Why drag Narendra Modi into any of this? Because the reaction itself reveals the problem. Instead of celebrating Pakistan's role, Pakistani leaders became preoccupied with who was getting the credit and who was not giving them credit. Prime Minister Modi's statement was straightforward. He welcomed the peace agreement. He expressed hope that it would bring stability to the region. That was it. No mention of mediators, no ranking of contributors. Yet, Pakistani Defense Minister interpreted the absence of praise as an insult. Why? Because Islamabad expected validation. Not from Washington, not from Tehran, but from New Delhi. And that is where the insecurity becomes visible. The real story here is not that Pakistan failed. Pakistan helped, it facilitated contacts, it carried messages, it hosted discussions. They are real contributions. But Pakistan mistook participation for ownership. It believed the deal belonged to Islamabad. It did not. The final agreement was the product of multiple actors: the US, Iran, Qatar, Pakistan, and several other diplomatic channels working simultaneously. But when crunch time arrived, it was Qatar's quiet diplomacy that appears to have made the decisive difference. Not Pakistan's press conferences, not Shehbaz Sharif's social media posts, not Pakistan's expectation of global applause. Qatar did not spend days demanding recognition. It spent 17 hours negotiating. And that is often the difference between diplomacy that gets headlines and diplomacy that gets results. In the end, Pakistan wanted to be remembered as the country that delivered peace between America and Iran. Instead, it may be remembered for something else. For announcing a signing ceremony that never happened, for claiming ownership of a deal it did not control, and for complaining that Narendra Modi did not applaud loudly enough. Meanwhile, the country that actually helped push the agreement over the finish line was doing what successful mediators usually do, working quietly and letting the outcome speak for itself. Because the loudest person in the room is not always the most important one. And in the story of the US-Iran peace deal, Qatar understood that better than anyone. This is Times Axis, where global stories meet India's perspective. Click on the bell icon to subscribe, because the next big global shift will have India at its center.